I want you to just picture the finish line of the Boston Marathon.
Mm-hmm.
It's April 15th, 2013. The clock's at 2:49 p.m. And it's just this scene of, peak humanity. Runners are finishing a race they've trained for years.
Families are cheering, volunteers handing out water.
Yeah, it's that happy kind of chaos. And then, in just 12 seconds, 2 pressure cooker bombs go off.
And that joy just, it completely inverts. It goes from a celebration to a war zone in a literal blink.
Yeah.
We all know the tragedy of that day 3 killed, hundreds injured. But for this deep dive, we're going to look at it a little differently. We're not looking at the explosion itself, but at the response.
Right.
Because if you look at the footage or you read the after-action reports, the seconds right after those blasts are defined by this massive convergence.
Right. I was looking at the timeline in the source material. It wasn't just, a few ambulances showing up. It was everyone. You had Boston Police, Fire, EMS, State Police, FBI, the National Guard, even just random bystanders rushing in. It was a flood. And my first instinct reading that is, good.
Of course.
You want the cavalry to arrive, right? But you flag something for me that suggests this flood of help is actually a nightmare scenario.
It absolutely is.
Yeah.
In the disaster management world, we call that the convergence problem. And it sounds completely counterintuitive, I know. But speed is dangerous if you don't have structure.
Oh.
There's a quote from one of the incident commanders that day that it perfectly captures the tension. He said, "Decisions stack up faster than they can be made."
Decisions stack up faster than they can be made. That's a heavy thought. It suggests the bottleneck isn't resources, it's your cognitive bandwidth.
Exactly. The central problem isn't a lack of effort. It's preventing the response from colliding with itself.
Okay.
Imagine dropping 1,000 well-meaning professionals into a smoking crater. The police want to secure the perimeter to catch a terrorist. The fire department wants to hose everything down to stop secondary fires. Medics need to rush in to save lives. If they all do their job at maximum intensity without a script, you don't get a rescue.
You get a traffic jam.
A traffic jam, exactly.
So that's our mission for this deep dive. We're going to unpack the operating system of disaster response. How do thousands of strangers from different agencies answering to different bosses manage to work together without just screaming over each other?
And what's so fascinating about Boston is that the system they used wasn't invented there. It was actually born from a totally different kind of disaster decades earlier.
We have to go back to 1970.
Southern California.
The 1970 wildfires. I was reading the stats on this, and they are just staggering. 16 large wildfires across the state in 13 days.
It was an absolute inferno. 500,000 acres destroyed, over 700 homes lost, 16 people died.
Wow.
And just like Boston, the problem wasn't lack of resources. California threw everything they had at it, trucks, planes, crews from every county, federal help. But the response was a catastrophe.
Because they couldn't talk to each other? Is that it?
It was deeper than just radio frequencies, although that was a huge part of it. They were speaking different professional languages.
What do you mean?
There's this famous example from the after-action report that is it's the perfect encapsulation of the fog of war. You had a ground crew fighting a fire on a ridge, and they radioed for a tanker.
Okay. A tanker. Seems simple enough.
Well, to a guy on the ground in a fire truck, a tanker is a water tender, a big truck carrying thousands of gallons of water.
Right. Makes sense.
But the person who got that radio call was from an agency where a tanker meant an air tanker, a plane.
Oh, no. So you have a crew desperate for a truck to refill their hoses.
And dispatch sends a plane, or vice versa. And while they're arguing about what vehicle is on its way, the fire jumps the line and burns down a neighborhood.
That is maddening.
And it was happening everywhere. You had resources being duplicated. 3 crews would show up to save one house while the house next door burned to the ground because everyone just assumed someone else had it covered.
It sounds like an organizational Tower of Babel.
That's a great way to put it. So after the fires were out, the fire chiefs and the agency heads had this brutal debrief. And they had to admit that people didn't just die because of the fire. They died because of the disorganization.
So they needed a common language.
They needed a standard management structure that just superseded whatever agency you worked for.
And this is the birth of ICS.
Yes. The Incident Command System. Think of ICS as a common operating system for emergencies. They decided that from then on, it didn't matter if you were federal, state, or local. When you arrive at a scene, you plug into a standard hierarchy.
So you leave your ego at the door and you fill a box on a chart.
That's the idea. And if I'm a police chief, but the chart says, for this incident, I'm reporting to a fire captain.
You have to step it up.
You have to suck it up. And you have to use standard terminology. No more 10 codes that are different in every town. You say water tender or air tanker, plain English. It relies on structure, not on personalities.
That sounds great on paper, but I have to imagine shifting the culture of, alpha personalities like cops and firefighters is incredibly difficult.
It took decades. And sadly, it took more tragedies to really refine it. ICS worked pretty well for fires, which are, there's somewhat predictable physics problems. But then the nature of our threats changed.
We have to talk about Columbine.
April 20th, 1999.
This feels like the moment the operating system needed a major update.
It really did.
Yeah.
Columbine changed the tactical playbook, but it also exposed this huge flaw in how different agencies integrated, or rather, how they didn't integrate.
Back then, the standard police doctrine was contain and wait.
Right. You set up a perimeter, you wait for SWAT, you try to negotiate. It was all built for a hostage situation.
Which makes sense as the bad guy wants something.
Exactly. But at Columbine, the shooters weren't taking hostages, they were active killers. So the police contained the school, which meant the shooters had free rein inside for almost an hour.
And while the police were waiting outside, you had fire and EMS staged blocks away because the scene wasn't secure.
That disconnect was fatal. You had kids bleeding out inside who needed immediate help. But the system said, police secure the area first, then medic center.
There was no in-between.
No. There was no mechanism for them to move together in what we now call a warm zone. An area that isn't totally safe, but is safe enough to go in and save lives. The police and fire departments were operating in total silos.
So the big tactical shift after Columbine was rapid entry. The first officer on scene goes in alone if they have to. But how did that change the structure?
It forced agencies to realize they couldn't just meet at the command post, they had to integrate their tactics. But the real structural revolution, the thing that gave us the system we have today, happened 2 years later.
September 11th.
9/11 pushed the scale beyond anything anyone had ever modeled. It completely broke the local ICS model. You had responders rushing to New York City from all over the country. You had firefighters from Ohio trying to help FDNY. And the problem was they couldn't plug in. Their radios didn't talk to each other. Their credentials were different. The local operating system crashed when it tried to go national.
So if ICS is the software on a single computer, we needed an internet to connect all the computers.
That's a perfect analogy. And that internet is NIMS, the National Incident Management System, introduced in 2004.
Okay, help me distinguish this because I feel like we're drowning in acronyms now. What's the real difference between ICS and NIMS?
Okay, think of it like a professional sports league. ICS is the rule book for a single game.
Who's the quarterback? What's a touchdown? How we score?
Exactly. NIMS is the league commissioner. NIMS sets the standards for the whole season. It dictates that every team has to use the same size ball, the same field dimensions, the same training requirements.
So NIMS makes sure that a firefighter from Kansas can show up to a hurricane in Florida and immediately understand the game that's being played.
Precisely. It manages the system, the credentialing, resource tracking, terminology, so that the incident can be managed effectively by ICS on the ground.
Which brings us to what feels like the most difficult part of this whole thing. We have the rules, NIMS, we have the playbook, ICS, but now you have to get the players to actually pass the ball to each other.
We need to talk about unified command.
This is the holy grail of disaster response.
And it is the hardest thing to pull off.
Because in Boston, you had the FBI, Boston PD, state police, fire, EMS, practically every three-letter agency you can imagine. And in a movie, this is the scene where they all argue over jurisdiction and, measure their authority.
And that absolutely happens in real life. The fundamental question is, how do you have 5 bosses?
Right. Doesn't someone eventually have to be the ultimate tiebreaker? If the fire chief says go left and the police commissioner says go right, who wins?
In a true unified command, the answer is neither. They don't give up their authority, they share the decision-making. The source material uses a brilliant analogy for this.
The surgical team. I like this one.
Picture a trauma bay. A patient is crashing. You have a heart surgeon, a trauma surgeon, and an anesthesiologist. Who's the boss?
Well, you'd think the head surgeon, right?
You'd think so. But in that specific moment, if the heart surgeon orders something that's going to collapse the patient's airway, the anesthesiologist has to override it.
Because they have different domains of expertise.
Exactly. The heart surgeon is focused on circulation. The trauma surgeon is stopping the bleeding. The anesthesiologist is managing breathing. They have to agree on the sequence of moves. If they compete, the patient dies.
And in this case, the patient is the city.
The patient is the community. But here's the friction point, and this is what makes it so hard. A fire chief and a police chief often have goals that are diametrically opposed.
Give me an example.
A bomb goes off. The fire chief sees a hazardous materials situation. Chemicals, fire risk, structural instability. Their goal is contain and clean. They want to wash everything down.
Okay.
But the police chief sees a crime scene. Their goal is preserve and investigate. If the fire chief washes the scene down,
He destroys the evidence the police chief needs to catch the guy who did it.
they are natural enemies in that moment.
So how do they resolve that?
Without unified command, they fight. With it, they stand in the same room and say, okay, we need to put out the fire, but we need to do it with a gentle mist spray instead of a high-pressure hose to save the evidence. They negotiate the tactic to satisfy both of their strategies.
But you can't have that negotiation for the first time while you're standing over a bleeding victim.
No. And that is the absolute key takeaway here. Trust has to be built before the disaster. You cannot exchange business cards at the burning building. If the police chief and fire chief haven't had coffee together, haven't trained together, unified command is just a fantasy on a piece of paper.
Which brings us all the way back to Boston in 2013. The reason Boston is such a powerful case study isn't just the tragedy, it's the fact that they had muscle memory.
They absolutely did. The Boston Marathon is treated as a planned disaster. They approach it as a mass casualty event every single year, just in case.
So when the bombs went off, the heads of police, fire, and EMS didn't have to introduce themselves.
They already knew each other. They had the system up and running within minutes.
And when you look at the medical data, the success is it's undeniable. 118 patients were transported to 8 different hospitals in under 2 hours.
And that stat 8 hospitals, that's the critical part.
Why is that so important?
In a disorganized response, ambulance drivers panic. They all just drive to the closest hospital.
And that hospital gets totally overwhelmed. It runs out of beds, doctors.
And people die in the waiting room, while another hospital just 3 miles away sits half empty.
So Unified Command basically acted like air traffic control for ambulances.
Yes. They distributed the load. Mass General is full. Send the next 5 ambulances to Beth Israel. That decision-making structure absolutely saved lives by preventing the medical system itself from collapsing under the surge.
However,
Right.
and we have to be real here because the hero narrative often glosses over this stuff, the response wasn't perfect.
Not at all.
Once the initial rescue was over and the investigation began, some pretty big cracks started to appear.
Oh, significant cracks.
Yeah.
The fog of war moved from the streets into the information space.
I was reading about the Alert Boston system. That's the city's emergency text and email system for the public.
Right.
It took them 2 hours to send the first alert.
2 hours.
Ugh.
You just imagine the panic and confusion in the city during that time. People knew something terrible had happened, but they didn't know if there were more bombs, if they should evacuate, if they should shelter in place.
The system was working for the guys with guns and hoses, but it failed the public initially.
It did. And then you had the Twitter problem.
Oh, the social media chaos.
It was unprecedented.
Yeah.
You had the Boston police cheating one thing, the mayor's office was saying something else, and the governor's office was releasing different details. They hadn't established a joint information center or a JIC.
And a JIC is basically Unified Command for Public Relations.
Exactly. It's the one place where all the agencies agree on the official truth before they release it to the public. Because they didn't have that running smoothly at first. You had conflicting reports about suspects, about arrests. It just fueled conspiracy theories and public panic.
And then the whole situation escalates into the manhunt in Watertown.
Right. The rescue is over. They've identified the Tsarnaev brothers. MIT officer Sean Collier has been killed. Now it's a chase.
And this is where the system was really stressed to its breaking point.
It was. You had thousands of officers self-deploying to Watertown.
Which is a polite way of saying they just showed up without being asked, right?
It is. I mean, every cop in New England wanted to help. And it's a noble instinct, but tactically, it was a mess. You had crossfire risks. You had officers parking their cruisers in ways that blocked the actual SWAT teams from getting in.
So you have this rigid structure, ICS, fighting against the very human desire to just do something.
That is the eternal tension of disaster response. The structure is there to protect us from our own best intentions.
There was also a legal friction point I hadn't even thought about. Privacy.
Yes, the HIPAA problem.
Right. Hospitals are legally terrified of releasing patient information. But you had families desperate to find out if their loved ones were alive and police desperate to interview victims for leads on the bombers.
And the hospitals just locked down. They didn't know if they were allowed to share that info under some mass casualty exception. So you had detectives literally hitting brick walls at the ER doors. That was a huge lesson learned for future events.
So Boston wasn't a perfect machine, but the argument here is that without that operating system, without ICS and NIMS, it would have been unrecoverable chaos.
Correct. The system bent. It definitely had gaps, but it didn't break. It provided just enough stability for the responders to adapt. If this had happened in 1970 with that tanker mindset, the death toll would have been significantly higher.
It's a really fascinating evolution when you think about it. We've gone from radios not working in California to a nationwide framework that lets a heart surgeon and a cop coordinate a citywide response.
And the real takeaway, I think, comes back to that quote from the Greek poet Archilochus. He said, "We do not rise to the level of our expectations. We fall to the level of our training."
We fall to the level of our training. That explains why that muscle memory from planning the marathon every year was the real hero of the day.
It explains everything. In a crisis, you don't get smarter. You actually get dumber. Your vision narrows. You just rely on the system you practiced. And if you didn't practice a system,
You have chaos.
you have chaos.
So here's a thought for you to carry with you. Next time you're driving and you see a fire truck or an ambulance racing past, lights and sirens on,
Don't just look at the vehicle.
think about the invisible handshake that's happening in the airwaves all around them.
Think about the years of boring meetings and flowcharts and acronyms that ensure when you call for help, the right people arrive, they all speak the same language, and they know exactly who is in charge.
It's the hidden structure of chaos. Thanks for diving in with us.
See you next time.